The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive Timelines members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The heat came first. Not the abstract warmth of memory, not the reconstructed sensation a dying mind sometimes conjures in its final moments. Real heat. Specific heat, the kind that bakes through thin fabric and presses against eyelids like a palm laid flat. The kind that only exists in one place in the galaxy. He did not gasp. He did not lurch upright with the dramatic desperation of a man pulled from drowning water. He simply lay still, on his back, on hard-packed sand, still radiating the morning's first warmth, and he breathed. His chest rose, it fell, it rose again. His lungs were small, he noticed that immediately, the capacity of them, the shallow ceiling they hit before filling completely. He breathed in slowly and felt the limit. He breathed out and felt the silica in the air, the fine white dust of the Junland wastes carried on a low wind from the northwest. His nose identified it before his mind named it. Tatooine dust had a particular mineral bite to it, alkaline and dry, unlike anything else in 30 years of worlds he had walked. He opened his eyes. Twin suns hung above him, one slightly higher and further west, the other brilliant and low, its light the color of hammered copper. He had seen this exact arrangement of sky before, not once, not twice, but in a deep vault of his oldest memory, in the specific drawer where a boy kept the things he looked at so often they became wallpaper. The twin suns at mid-morning, the sky an impossible blue-white. No clouds. There were never clouds on Tatooine. He raised his right hand and held it above his face. Small fingers, brown from a childhood of outdoor work, a shallow cut across the second knuckle, recently healed, a little pink still at the edges. The nail of his thumb was chipped. He had chipped it this morning, before whatever this was, trying to lever the seized coupling on the Vaporator's secondary manifold with a rock because he'd misplaced his toolkit. He remembered that. He remembered it from a distance of 44 years, corrected from 53 years. Luke died at 53, and 9 plus 44 equals 53. He sat up slowly. He was 9 years old. He was in the yard behind the Lars homestead, 20 meters from the east entrance, the side Owen used for equipment storage. The battered T7 Vaporator stood 3 meters away, its collection tower catching the thin morning wind, its base panel still hanging open where he'd been working. The toolkit was lying in the sand beside it. He had not misplaced it, he had simply forgotten to look down. For a long moment he sat completely still and let the Force speak. It flooded him. That was the only word for it. A flood, not a trickle. Not the carefully managed flow he had learned to work with across decades of training and discipline, and the particular kind of restraint that comes from understanding how much damage an unguarded master can do. The Force here, in this body, was not managed. It was a river that had never been dammed, moving through channels so clean and unobstructed that the current nearly knocked him sideways with its joy. He held it. He did not flinch from it. He had learned in a lifetime that the Force was not a tool and not a weapon. It was a conversation. He sat in the sand behind the homestead of his childhood, and he listened to what it was saying. It said, "You are here." It said, "There is work to do." He let out a slow breath, closed his eyes, and began to catalogue. Obi-Wan Kenobi was alive. He was in the Junland wastes, perhaps 40 kilometers north-northwest, his Force presence dim and flinching, a lantern turned down so low the flame barely survived the wick. Luke could feel the shape of it, the outline of something enormous deliberately made small, the particular quality of a Jedi who had stopped trusting himself to use what he was. He had felt that shape before, in others, in the survivors the Empire left behind. He knew what it meant. It meant years of a man telling himself the Force was a thing that had failed him, rather than a thing that grieved alongside him. He would reach Obi-Wan. Not today, not until he understood the contours of now. He pressed further outward, gently, like a hand laid flat against water rather than pushed through it. 30,000 light-years away, on a world of snow-peaked mountains and pale cities and gardens that seemed to grow because the planet simply could not stop being beautiful. A girl burned in the Force like a brazier, corrected from waterfalls and white cities. Waterfalls are Naboo's visual identity. Alderaan's are its mountains, open plains, and pale, deliberate architecture. Fierce and unguarded and entirely unaware of herself. His sister, 9 years old, the same age as this body, and already more politically certain than most senators he had known as an adult. She was safe. She was whole. She was brilliant. She did not know yet what she was. He would reach her too. Soon, but carefully, he opened his eyes and looked at the vaporator. He stood, brushed the sand from the backs of his legs, picked up the toolkit, and got back to work. The seized couplings surrendered in 4 minutes. His hands moved with a confidence that had no business existing in fingers this size. The muscle memory belonged to someone else, someone taller, someone who had spent his 20s underneath X-wings in conditions far worse than a sunny Tatooine morning. But the knowledge translated. His hands found the right angle, applied the right torque, and the coupling broke free with a sound like a held breath finally released. He reseated it. He checked the atmospheric intake valve, which was clogged with 3 weeks of fine sand buildup. He cleared it. He checked the moisture collection membrane and found a hairline fracture on the lower left quadrant, invisible from any angle except directly underneath, with the sun behind you. He was lying on his back in the dirt examining it, when he also noticed the secondary coupling on the adjacent unit. Not seized, not yet, but worn thin at the joint, the threading stripped down to the last few viable turns. Another 3 days of operation and it would fail entirely. Owen hadn't noticed it. Owen's eyes were tired, and the light in the mornings came from the wrong angle to catch that particular glint of stressed metal. He replaced it with a spare from the kit. Then he collected his tools, closed the access panel, and stood back to consider his work. The vaporators hummed with the quiet satisfaction of machines doing what they were made to do. He checked the second unit's collection gauge. He adjusted the intake angle 2 degrees west to better catch the prevailing wind. He was not showing off. There was no one watching. He simply could not see a thing that needed doing and choose not to do it. He was 10 meters from the entrance when the smell reached him. Beru's cooking, something with blue milk and dried herbs, the specific combination she made on mornings when she had extra time and felt generous with it. He had eaten this meal hundreds of times in his first life, and had not thought of it in 30 years. The smell hit him now like a fist pressed gently against his sternum. Not pain exactly. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as pain, but quieter. He went inside. The table was small, as he remembered it, practical and plain, with 4 seats that had never all been occupied at the same time since his earliest years. The light through the homestead's narrow windows fell in a single shaft across the middle of it. Catching the steam rising from the serving bowl Beru was setting down as he came through the door. She looked up. "There you are. I was about to send Owen to check on you." The secondary coupling on the east unit needed replacing, he said, and sat down in his chair. His chair, the one with the slightly uneven leg, the one he had always slightly preferred without knowing why. I also cleared the intake valve on the primary. It had 3 weeks of buildup. Beru stared at him for a moment, with the expression she sometimes wore when he said things she couldn't quite locate on the map of what a 9-year-old should say. Then she smiled and set down his cup. "Wash your hands first." He washed his hands. Owen came in from the equipment room, pulling a cloth along his knuckles, the smell of lubricant following him like a shadow. He sat down at the head of the table without ceremony, pulled the serving bowl toward himself, and looked at Luke with the particular brand of evaluation Owen Lars performed without appearing to. Sideways. Brief. Cataloging. "Vaporator running?" "Yes. I also replaced the secondary coupling on the east unit. The threading was almost gone." Owen's hands paused fractionally over the bowl. He set down the ladle. He looked at Luke directly for a moment, then looked away. "Right?" he said, and served himself. Beru sat. The 3 of them ate. Wind moved across the homestead's outer skin with the low, continuous sound of a note held on a string instrument. Outside, the twin suns climbed their separate arcs across the same sky. Luke looked at his plate. He looked at the table, at the grain of the material, at the place where the surface was worn smooth near Owen's usual spot from 20 years of elbows. He looked at Beru's hands wrapped around her cup, the particular economy of her movements, the way she always checked whether everyone else had enough before she took anything for herself. He looked at Owen's face, creased and careful, and quietly full of a love the man had never once said aloud. He felt the force hum around the 3 of them, soft and ordinary and completely irreplaceable. Aunt Beru. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for every day." The words were plain. He had not dressed them up or arranged them for effect. They were the truest sentence he currently had available, distilled from 44 years of accumulated understanding about what mattered and what didn't. And he gave them to her without ceremony because that was the only way they could be received. Beru was still for a moment. Then she made a soft sound that was not quite a laugh and reached over and touched his hair with the back of her fingers, a brief, instinctive gesture of the kind that does not require thought because it comes from somewhere below thought. "Strange boy," she said, warmly. Owen cleared his throat. "Food's getting cold," he said, and pulled the bread toward himself and said nothing else. Luke looked down at his plate and smiled. At sunset, he stood at the outer lip of the homestead, at the place where the packed sand gave way to the open desert, and he watched the twin suns descend. They moved at different speeds at different angles, meeting the horizon at different points, one slipping below the curve of the world in clean silence, the other burning a long, slow orange fade that stained the entire western sky. He had watched this specific sunset from this specific place more times than he could count. He had watched it as a boy full of impatience and hunger for something beyond the horizon. He had watched it in memory, in his later years, with the particular ache of a man who had gotten everything he asked for and understood too late what he had been standing on. He watched it now without impatience and without ache. The Force moved through the desert air the way it always had here, old and patient, and entirely unbothered by anything so small as the passage of time. It moved through him the same way. He thought of Obi-Wan alone in his cave, his flame turned down to almost nothing. He thought of Leia on Alderaan, burning bright and unguarded in the Force, utterly unaware that someone was already looking. He thought of a man in black armor, somewhere deep in the Empire's machinery, breathing through a machine that kept him alive, and reminded him, with every mechanical hiss, of what he had lost. He thought of all of it, and he did not look away from any of it, and then he let it settle into the same still place where everything settled eventually. The last sun touched the horizon. He watched it go. He had work to do. He left before the homestead woke. The sky was still the deep bruised blue of pre-dawn. Both suns buried somewhere below the eastern horizon, the air carrying the specific cold that Tatooine held onto through the night, like a miser, close-fisted until the moment it had no choice but to release it. He had pulled on his outer cloak in the dark, moving through the homestead without sound, the way a man moves through a place he knows so completely that his body navigates it separately from his mind. On the kitchen counter, a small cloth-wrapped roll sat on the edge of the surface where Beru always left them. He took it. He filled his water container at the reclamation tap, sealed it, clipped it to his belt. He went out through the east entrance and turned north. The Junland wastes did not welcome or warn. They simply existed, ancient and completely indifferent to anything moving across their surface. The rock formations rose on either side of the low passes in shapes that suggested violence at a geological scale, as though the planet had broken itself open eons ago and then gone quiet and never healed over. The sand between the formations was pale and fine, the kind that recorded footprints for hours before the wind erased them. He watched his own small footprints appear behind him and did not worry about what they meant. He navigated the way a Jedi navigates terrain with no map, not through visual landmarks but through the Force, which moved differently across different kinds of ground the way water carries the shape of wherever it has been. He found the passes that opened without effort. He moved around the ones that wanted to funnel him toward exposure. The Junland wastes had their own rhythm, their own logic, and he walked inside it rather than against it. 40 kilometers north-northwest, he had felt the distance the same way he felt depth, not as a number but as a quality, a particular weight in the Force, a particular texture of something that had once been immense and was now deliberately, painfully small. The sun broke the horizon at the 2-hour mark. The cold released. The heat began its daily renegotiation with the land. He walked without hurry, which was not the same as walking slowly. He ate the bread roll at the first ridge. He drank water at the second. He watched a pair of womp rats vanish into a crevice in the rock, when they sensed him coming, and felt, briefly, the small vivid thread of their fear and then their absence. He had been walking for nearly 3 hours when he felt it directly. He stopped. The Force, which had been moving freely around him like air, ran against something, not an obstacle exactly, but a resistance. A place where something living had pulled itself tight, compressed its own presence down to the smallest possible signature, packed it inward with years of practiced suppression. If he hadn't been who he was, hadn't known exactly what he was looking for, he might have walked past it entirely. He turned toward a rock formation that looked like every other rock formation in this part of the wastes. A shallow natural alcove had been extended by deliberate effort. Stones arranged with care, a wind cloth strung across the upper entrance, faded now to the same color as the surrounding rock. In the shadows underneath it, the dark mouth of a cave that went back further than its exterior suggested. Luke walked to the entrance and sat down in the sand. He sat cross-legged, hands resting on his knees, and waited. The wind moved. A stone shifted somewhere above on the formation, settling in the heat. A distant sound, faint, rhythmic, came from inside the cave and then stopped. Then came again. Someone breathing, and then adjusting their breathing, and then going still. 3 minutes passed. A face appeared at the cave mouth. He looked older than he should. That was the first thing. Obi-Wan Kenobi was in his mid-40s, but the face that appeared in the cave's shadow had been worked over by years of desert sun, and something harder than sun. A sustained internal pressure that carved lines differently than age alone. The beard was longer than Luke remembered from their brief years together. The robes were clean but thin, washed so many times the fabric had lost memory of its original weight. His eyes in the shadow were a pale and careful blue. Those eyes moved over the small boy sitting in the sand outside his home. They moved with the practiced assessment of a man who had trained himself to evaluate threat as reflexively as breathing. Boy. Alone. No weapons visible. Small. 9 years old, perhaps. Sitting in a meditation posture with the natural ease of someone who had grown up sitting that way, which no Tatooine child had any reason to do. The eyes paused on that. Then Obi-Wan stepped fully into the entrance, and his whole bearing shifted. Shoulders forward, chin dropped slightly, mouth pulling into an expression of baffled, exaggerated concern. His voice, when it came, had the cracked and wandering quality of a man who spent most of his days talking to no one. "My goodness," he said, looking past Luke and then at him and then past him again. "Are you lost, child? This is no place for a boy alone. Sand people move through this corridor by midday. I've seen 3 groups this week alone. Very aggressive, very unpredictable. I wouldn't recommend sitting in the open like that." He stepped closer, gesturing vaguely at the terrain behind Luke. "Where did you come from? Is there a family nearby?" "There shouldn't be. There's nothing out here, nothing at all. Just an old madman and his rocks. And the madman isn't particularly good company, I should tell you that up front." Luke let him finish. He watched Obi-Wan move through the performance with the detached appreciation of someone watching a skilled thing done badly. The technique was present, the execution confident, but underneath it the Force told a different story entirely. Underneath the eccentric rambling, a heartbeat elevated, hands that had settled into precisely the kind of loose readiness a Jedi maintains when they are uncertain of what stands in front of them. A Force presence that had been dim and contracted a moment ago and was now flickering, reaching outward involuntarily, drawn by something it couldn't stop itself from reaching toward. The performance wound down. Obi-Wan stood 3 meters away and waited for the boy to be frightened, or confused, or to say he was lost. Luke looked at him steadily. "Master Kenobi," he said. The name landed in the air between them. Obi-Wan went still in the way a person goes still when they haven't heard a particular word spoken aloud in years, and their body responds before their mind can manage it. Luke continued. His voice was a child's voice. The weight inside it was not. "I know who you are. I know who I am. I know what happened on Mustafar." He paused. "I know that Qui-Gon Jinn has been trying to reach you. And I know that you cannot hear him yet, because you have not forgiven yourself enough to believe you deserve to." The desert wind moved through the space between them and said nothing. Obi-Wan's face had gone through several things in the span of those sentences. The performed eccentricity had left it first, dropping away cleanly the moment Luke said the name. What replaced it cycled through wariness and calculation, and something very briefly that might have been hope before it flinched back behind a wall. His hand had not moved toward his belt, but something in his posture had made note of the location. He said, very quietly, in his actual voice, "Who sent you?" "No one sent me." Luke held the man's eyes. "My name is Luke Skywalker. I am 9 years old, and I am 44 years old, and both of those things are true at the same time. I am here because the Force brought me here, because there is work to do that I cannot do without you, and because you have been alone in this desert for 9 years eating yourself from the inside out." He let that sit for a moment. "I would like to come in. I have water, and I'm told I'm reasonable company. Corrected from 53 years old. Luke died at 53. As a 9-year-old, the memory distance from his death back to this point is 44 years. Obi-Wan stepped back from the entrance. It was not an invitation exactly. It was the absence of a refusal. Luke accepted it as such and ducked under the windcloth into the cave. The interior was austere in the way of a place that had been organized by someone with nowhere to go and a great deal of time. A sleeping area with a folded blanket pressed flat with military precision. A small heat unit, cold. A shelf of provisions, carefully rationed. A low surface with a single object on it, a small holographic projector, powered down. The air smelled of stone and dry heat, and something else, faint and underneath the rest, like the memory of incense. Luke sat on the floor. After a moment, Obi-Wan sat across from him. Neither of them reached for a lamp. The light that came through the entrance was sufficient, and they both seemed to agree on that without discussing it. Obi-Wan studied him in the way of a man cataloging a problem, taking inventory of the child's face, the posture, the stillness that sat in the boy's small frame like a stone sits in water, at the bottom, unmoving. "The force coming off you," he said carefully, "is unlike anything I have encountered in a living person." "I know," Luke said. "It feels like—" Obi-Wan stopped. He tried again. "It feels like speaking to someone who has already died," Luke said. "Yes, I have." Silence. "Tell me about Qui-Gon," Obi-Wan said. The name cost him something to say. It came out stripped of performance, every layer of protection gone, just the name hanging in the cool air of the cave. Luke was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he chose every word the way a surgeon chooses instruments. "He learned to preserve consciousness through the cosmic force," he said. "He found the path that the ancient Jedi believed was impossible, or lost, or both. He has been trying to teach you the same thing since before Order 66. And every time he reaches for you across that distance, you cannot hear him. Not because he isn't speaking, you have to believe you are worth being spoken to." Obi-Wan was looking at the floor. The tendons in his hands were visible against the backs of them. "I left him burning," he said. It was not an explanation. It was the shortest version of a sentence he had been living inside for over a decade. "I know," Luke said, "and I know what Maul's blade felt like going through him, and I know what the shaft looked like from the bottom, and I know you held him while he told you the prophecy was real, that the Chosen One would bring balance. And then he was gone, and you were left holding a promise you had no idea how to keep." He leaned forward slightly. "And then you tried. For 13 years you tried. And the mission ended the way it ended, on a black shore, and you have been telling yourself ever since that the ending was your fault." Obi-Wan's jaw was tight. He said nothing. "It was not your fault," Luke said. The words were plain and direct, and offered without softness or sentimentality, which was precisely why they struck as deeply as they did. His choices were his. Palpatine built a trap across 20 years and deployed it with patience and precision that no Jedi, however gifted, was positioned to identify in time. You were not blind. You were looking in the wrong direction, because the enemy was standing in the one place no one thought to look. A long silence. The wind outside, the small sounds of the desert settling into mid-morning heat. "Anakin," Obi-Wan said, in a voice that had no performance left in it. Just the name, like a wound probed carefully. "Is alive," Luke said. Obi-Wan looked up. "He is not the man you trained. He has not been that man for a long time. But Anakin Skywalker is not dead. He is imprisoned inside what Palpatine built in his place. I know this because I was there when the prison opened." Luke met the pale, hollowed eyes across from him. "I watched him lift the Emperor off the ground and carry him to the shaft and throw him in. I watched him choose his son over 20 years of darkness. I watched him die as himself." Something moved in Obi-Wan's face that had not moved in a very long time. Luke shifted forward and reached out, and his small hands wrapped around Obi-Wan's larger ones, where they rested on the cave floor. He looked up at the man above him with the absolute steadiness of someone who has nothing left to fear and nothing left to prove. "I forgive you," he said, "on behalf of Anakin Skywalker, not because you were perfect, because you loved him and you tried, and love is not made smaller by failing to save what it reaches for." Obi-Wan made a sound that was not a word. It came from somewhere below the chest, where things are kept that have not been allowed out. His hands turned over under Luke's and held on, and he bent forward, and his shoulders moved once. And the cave held the sound of a man who had not wept in years, because he had decided, quietly and without telling anyone, that he did not deserve to. Luke held his hands and said nothing more. After a long time, the quality of the air in the cave changed. Not dramatically, not with any visible manifestation, but Luke felt it. The Force presence that had been a dim and flinching ember for the duration of their conversation began, with the slow uncertainty of something that had forgotten its own nature, to expand. Just slightly, just enough. Obi-Wan raised his head. His face was wet and entirely unguarded, stripped of every layer of Ben the Hermit, and Ben the Madman, and Ben the Watching and Waiting and Failing. Just Obi-Wan, just the man under all of it. He looked at this impossible child, and did not have a single word for what he was looking at. Then, from somewhere at the very edge of the Force's reach, not a voice, not words, not anything that could be directly named, there was a presence, brief, unmistakable, a warmth like a hand laid briefly on a shoulder in passing. There and then gone, but undeniably, irrefutably there. Obi-Wan went completely still. Luke smiled. "There he is," he said quietly. "He's been waiting." He released Obi-Wan's hands and straightened, and his voice, when it came, carried the ease of a man who had been looking forward to this particular conversation for a very long time. "Let's start from the beginning," he said. "Tell me what Qui-Gon taught you that you haven't practiced in 10 years. The cave was deepest at its far end, where the rock formation's natural geometry created a pocket of near-perfect stillness. No wind reached it. The ambient sound of the wastes, the low, continuous conversation of stone and air and distant heat, fell away at a precise distance from the back wall, as though the sound itself had decided not to intrude. Luke had found this spot on his 3rd day in the cave. He had not told Obi-Wan why he spent so much time sitting there. Obi-Wan, to his credit, had not asked. 2 weeks had changed the man in measurable ways. Not dramatically. Recovery of the kind Obi-Wan required did not move dramatically. It moved the way light moves across a floor in winter, slow enough that you only noticed the change when you looked away and looked back. But the changes were real. His Force presence, which had been a flinching, contracted thing when Luke first sat in the sand outside his door, now reached outward to the walls of the cave without effort. He had begun meditating again. Not the rigid, suppressive sitting the Jedi Council had favored, the kind designed to empty the mind and hold it empty, but the open and listening practice Luke had demonstrated on Ahch-To, the kind that did not ask the Force to be quiet, but asked the practitioner to stop speaking over it. His hands were steadier. He ate better. Twice, during their morning sessions, Luke had caught him smiling at something small, the way light came through the windcloth at a particular angle. The sound a stone made rolling down the outer formation in the evening wind, and smiling without immediately suppressing it. These were not small things. Luke knew what they cost. This morning, Obi-Wan had left before the heat peaked, heading south toward a settlement where he occasionally traded dried goods for protein rations under the name Ben. He had said he would be back by midday. Luke had nodded and said nothing. He had been waiting for this window for 4 days. He settled into the far corner, cross-legged, his cloak folded under him against the cold of the rock floor. He rolled his shoulders once. He placed his hands open on his knees, palms up, the posture of reception rather than direction. He breathed in, he breathed out. He let the cave's stillness meet him. The first expansion was local, his awareness moving outward from his body in a slow, even ring, the way a stone's impact moves across water. The cave's dimensions became tactile. He felt the rough geometry of the back wall behind him, the angular shelf to his left, the faint trace of Obi-Wan's presence still warm in the air from his sleeping area. He felt the formations above, the weight of rock layered and compressed over millions of years, patient and enormous, holding its own counsel. He moved outward. The Junland wastes spread in every direction, and through the Force they felt the way they looked from height. Vast and broken and old, crossed by the thread-like paths of small creatures going about the business of survival. He felt the settlement to the south, a small knot of life, human and non-human, compressed into the particular density of a market exchange. Obi-Wan somewhere within it, his presence a point of familiar warmth. Luke released the local and moved further. This was the work. This was what had taken 4 days of careful preparation, not the technique itself, which he knew as well as his own breathing, but the management of it through a child's body. The vessel was willing. The vessel was always willing. It was built from his own cells, carried his own force sensitivity, was in many ways the purest version of what he had always been before training overlaid it with intention. But it was 9 years old. Its stamina had a ceiling. The last time he had reached this far without a body rated for it, it had killed him. He would be careful. He would be faster than he had ever needed to be before. He moved through the system, through the star's gravity well, outward along the force the way a signal travels a wire. Not through space, but through the connective tissue of the living galaxy, the force current that ran between all things the way blood runs between the heart and the extremities. The galaxy was not empty when you traveled this way. It was full, impossibly, overwhelmingly full, of everything alive, and everything that had ever lived, and everything that lived in the space between those two conditions. He did not stop to examine any of it. He moved with purpose. He was looking for a specific frequency. He had first heard it 40 years from now, when a dying father held his hand and told him a truth that reorganized his understanding of everything he had ever been. He had carried the frequency of his sister's force presence inside him like a tuning fork. Since that moment, the particular harmonic signature of someone who burned hot and fierce and stubborn at the cellular level, whose emotional life was organized around conviction rather than feeling, who had always been stronger than anyone credited and had known it since before she had words for it. He found it in seconds, 30,000 light-years away, blazing in the force like a coal in dark water, untrained and unshielded and entirely itself. He approached it the way you approach a flame you don't want to startle out, with deliberation, with care, with no sudden movement in the force. He had thought carefully about what he was doing here and what it could cost her. A 9-year-old girl hearing an unfamiliar presence in the deepest part of her mind had every right to be frightened. He would not be frightening. He would be exactly what she needed, which was real and gentle and already familiar in the way that things are familiar when they belong to you without your knowing it yet. He rested his presence against hers, lightly, like a hand resting on a windowsill. Leia Organa was in the middle of losing an argument with herself. The argument was about whether it was worth going back to her father's office to make the case one more time. The case being that she was 9 years old and fully capable of sitting through a Senate briefing on outer rim trade policy without causing a diplomatic incident, regardless of what the protocol droid had implied. She had made this case twice already. The second time had gone less well than the first, because she had used the phrase logically unsupportable, and her father had pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose in the way that meant she was correct, but also that being correct was not the only relevant factor. She was standing at her bedroom window, looking at Alderaan's capital from 17 floors up, the city spread below in its characteristic geometry. Not the aggressive vertical ambition of Coruscant's skyline, but something lower and more deliberate, built to the scale of the mountains behind it, the buildings pale and the gardens between them catching the afternoon light. She was drafting a third argument in her head when the room changed. Not visibly. The light was the same. The city below was the same. But the air acquired a quality she had no name for, a warmth without heat, a presence without weight, a stillness that was somehow more complete than ordinary quiet, as though the room had been listening for something and had just heard it. She turned away from the window. Nothing. The room empty as before. But the quality remained, and it was not frightening, which was itself strange, because Leia Organa was not in the habit of accepting unexplained sensations without a complete audit of their potential causes. She stood very still and waited, because whatever this was, it was not leaving, and it was not hostile, and underneath both of those observations was a third one that she did not examine directly. It was familiar. It was familiar in a way that she had no evidence for, no memory to support, no rational basis whatsoever. She said very quietly to the empty room, "Hello?" He felt her voice through the force before he heard it as language, felt the particular sharp, bright quality of it. Leia at 9 years old, already fully herself, calling out into a space she didn't understand with a directness that stopped just short of demand. He steadied himself against the distance and spoke back, not with sound, with presence, with the force communication that existed below the threshold of language, the kind that carried the shape of a thought rather than its literal content. He sent, "I am here. You are not imagining this. You are safe." A pause. Then, back through the connection, sharp and immediate. Who are you? Even through the force, at 9 years old, across 30,000 light-years, Leia Organa's first response to an unknown voice was a demand for identification. Luke felt something enormous and warm move through his chest. He organized his words carefully, like setting a table. Nothing out of place, nothing that would land wrong. "My name is Luke," he said, through the Force. "I am a boy about your age. I'm very far away. I can speak to you like this because we share a connection that is real and old, and I will explain it to you properly when we meet in person, which will happen soon. What you are feeling right now has a name. It is called the Force, and you are sensitive to it, which means it will speak to you like this sometimes. What I am doing right now, reaching across the distance to find you, is something called a Force bond. It works between people who are already connected." Another pause. Longer this time. He imagined her standing in her room, organizing the information, stress testing it. "That is a remarkable amount of information to deliver to someone you just introduced yourself to," she said. Even at 9, her syntax was immaculate. "I know," he said. "You prefer directness. I thought it would save time. How do you know what I prefer? Immediate, pointed." "I know you," he said simply and truthfully. "Not from a conversation. From a longer time." He felt her sit with that. She did not accept or reject it. She filed it, he could tell, in the drawer she kept for things that required more evidence before reaching a conclusion. He loved this about her. "All right, Luke," she said. "What do you want?" "I want to teach you something," he said. "One thing today. It's important, possibly the most important thing I'll ever teach you, and I need you to practice it every day until we meet." "What is it?" He felt her focus sharpen, and he moved carefully into the part of her mind she had left open to him. Just the surface, the active, present layer, and he showed her what he needed her to see. "Imagine a room," he said. "Yours, exactly as you want it. Every object in it is chosen by you. The walls are as thick as you make them, and the door has one lock, a lock that only exists in your hands." He felt her build it in real time, and the speed of it almost stopped him. The room assembled itself in her mind with the crisp, immediate architecture of someone whose imagination worked faster than most adults' deliberate thought. The walls went up solid. The objects arranged themselves exactly. The door was heavy, lacquered, with a large and elegant lock. "Now close it," he said, "and keep it closed, always, no matter who asks, no matter who insists they have a reason to come in." "Why?" she said. "Because there are people in the galaxy who can walk through open minds," he said, "and take what they find there. And you are too important to be walked through." A silence. Then, with the quiet certainty of someone who has just decided something permanently, "It's closed." He felt it close. The mental shield that came down was not a beginner's effort. It came down with the instinctive solidity of someone whose stubbornness was itself a structural material. Luke had never felt anything like it. He had spent decades teaching Force-sensitive students to build this shield. None of them had done it on the first attempt, in under a minute, across an interstellar Force bond, at 9 years old. He released the connection gently. The return was immediate. The cave rushing back, the stone floor, the cold, the particular quality of Tatooine's Force. His nose was bleeding. He could feel the trembling in his small hands before he looked at them. He sat quietly until it passed. When he leaned his head back against the cave wall, he was smiling. A sound at the entrance. Obi-Wan, back early, ducking under the wind cloth carrying a wrapped parcel of provisions. He stopped when he saw Luke against the back wall, face pale, a thin trace of blood drying on his upper lip, smiling at the ceiling with the tranquility of a man who has just received extremely good news. Obi-Wan set down the parcel. He looked at the boy for a long moment. "You're bleeding," he said. "I'm fine," Luke said. "You look like you've just traveled 30,000 light years and back." "About that," Luke said. He opened his eyes and looked at his old master across the length of the cave. "She's extraordinary, Obi-Wan." Obi-Wan was quiet. Something moved through his expression, too fast to be named entirely, but Luke caught the edges of it, relief and grief, and an old love that had never had a proper place to live. "Yes," Obi-Wan said after a moment, "she is." He picked up the parcel and carried it to the shelf, and said nothing more, and the cave held them both in its particular and sufficient silence. He felt it on a Tuesday. He had no particular reason to track the days of the week. Tatooine's calendar meant little to a man living in a cave in the Junlan wastes, and less to the 53-year-old soul inside the boy living in that cave. But Obi-Wan had a habit of marking Tuesdays by the specific meal he cooked. a habit left over from some structure he had imposed on himself early in the exile years to prevent the days from blurring entirely. It was Tuesday because there were dried legumes soaking in a bowl near the heat unit, and Tuesday was legume day, and the legumes were soaking when the cold pressure arrived in the force, like a shadow passing over standing water. Luke was in the outer clearing, 3 meters from the cave entrance, barefoot in the packed sand. Obi-Wan stood 6 meters away, slightly angled, his weight distributed the way Luke had spent the past 2 weeks correcting. Not the stiff parade readiness the Jedi Temple had favored, but lower, looser, the weight living in the hips rather than the shoulders, the knees with their natural give. He held a stick. Luke held a stick. This was their morning practice. Force evasion drills using whatever the desert provided, because Luke had no intention of constructing a second lightsaber purely for training purposes, and because a stick, thrown by someone with Obi-Wan's precision, was sufficient to teach the lesson. The lesson today had been about footwork, specifically about the half-step, the smallest possible unit of movement that takes a body entirely out of the path of a committed strike. Luke had demonstrated it 11 times. Obi-Wan had been getting it right on the last 4 attempts, which meant the principle was landing but the instinct wasn't there yet, which meant they needed another week at minimum before moving to anything more complex. They would not have another week here. Luke lowered his stick. Obi-Wan noticed immediately. In 2 weeks, he had relearned something he had known for 40 years. When Luke went still with that quality of stillness, it was not a pause in attention, but an intensification of it. "What is it?" Obi-Wan said. Luke was already orienting north-northwest, feeling the cold pressure resolve itself into something more specific. Dark side, not the ambient dark side residue that clung to certain places and certain histories, but an active and living source, carried by a person moving toward them at speed. The signature had a particular shape to it, a particular interior architecture. He had felt this architecture before. Not this specific person, but this specific wound, the kind that had been infected so long it had become structural, load-bearing, the kind a person organized their entire identity around, because the alternative was confronting what lived underneath it. He felt the obsession driving it, tight and burning and very old. He felt the rage that was not the top of the feeling, but the middle layer of it. And underneath both, pressed down and compressed and covered with years of deliberate ice, the specific terror of a child who had watched people who were supposed to protect her turn and become the thing she needed protecting from. He knew that particular frequency. He had met it in the galaxy's long history of people the Empire had used up and discarded. He had never expected to meet it here, this early, moving toward him across the Jundland wastes in full Inquisitor armor with a double-bladed lightsaber on her back. "Go inside," he said. Obi-Wan's hand had tightened on the stick. "Luke, she's not tracking you specifically. She found my signal from the Leia meditation." He turned to look at Obi-Wan directly. "If she sees you, it becomes a different problem. Go inside. Stay back from the entrance. Don't reach out in the Force. Keep your presence where it's been." A pause. He watched Obi-Wan's face move through the calculation. The soldier's instinct against the new and uncomfortable experience of trusting a 9-year-old boy's tactical assessment over his own. "You're 9 years old," Obi-Wan said, and it came out less like an objection than like a man reminding himself of a fact he found persistently difficult to integrate. Luke tilted his head. "I know." He turned back to face north-northwest and waited. She came through the narrow passage between the 2 largest formations, with the efficiency of someone who had been tracking targets in hostile terrain for a decade, and had stopped finding it interesting. Her armor was black and fitted, the inquisitorious insignia at the shoulder, her dark hair pulled back with the practical severity of a person who had eliminated every unnecessary variable from their physical presentation. The red saber staff was not yet ignited, but her right hand rested near the hilt with the automatic readiness of long habit. She cleared the passage and stopped. The barefoot 9-year-old boy standing in the clearing sand, hands clasped behind his back, was watching her arrive with an expression she had never encountered on a target. No fear, no alarm. No performance of bravado to cover fear, just a calm, level attention, the kind you found in people who had made their peace with what was in front of them long before it arrived. She stood 20 meters away and completed her own assessment in seconds. Boy, alone apparently. The Force signature that had drawn her here across 2 days of tracking was definitely emanating from this child, which made no operational sense, and was therefore automatically suspicious. The signature was enormous. She was force-sensitive enough to read the outlines of another presence, and what she read here was the outline of something that dwarfed most of the Jedi she had hunted. She ignited the saber staff. The twin blades threw red light across the sand. "Where is the Jedi?" she said. Luke looked at her for a moment with the attentive quiet of someone listening to something slightly different than the words being spoken. "She's not here for the Jedi she thinks she's looking for," he said. "She's here for the one who hurt her." Reva's eyes narrowed. Her grip shifted on the staff. She had been spoken to in many ways by targets and informants and prisoners across 10 years of this work, and she had developed a precise taxonomy of deflection strategies, the ones designed to confuse, to delay, to manipulate, to beg. This did not fit any of them. This boy spoke about her in the third person, as though reading from a text, and his voice had the quality of someone stating observable fact rather than attempting any of the things a person in his position should be attempting. She closed the distance at a run. The strike she opened with was not experimental. It was a committed diagonal cut that would have opened a standing adult from left shoulder to right hip, delivered at the speed she reserved for targets she had already assessed as capable. She had assessed this one as capable. She did not know why. Precisely. She trusted the assessment. The boy was not there. He moved with a half-step, the smallest possible relocation, taking him entirely out of the blade's path, with an economy of motion so precise it looked effortless, the way anything looks effortless when it is the product of decades of accumulated understanding, compressed into a single unhurried movement. The blade passed through empty air. She felt the displaced wind of it on her own follow-through. She spun the staff and drove the second blade back in a reverse diagonal. He redirected it, not with a block, not with force energy pushed against her strike, but with a subtle outward pressure applied to her wrist through the force. Gentle enough to feel almost like her own movement, steering the blade's arc 2 degrees wide. The tip carved a line in the sand 6 centimeters from his left foot. He was not breathing hard. She reset and came at him with a 3-strike combination she had used to kill a Jedi Knight on Felucia. Fast and sequential, each strike designed to close the evasion window created by the previous one. He moved through all 3 of them, not away from her. Through them, his path taking him around the edges of each strike, the way water takes the path of least resistance. The way something moves when it is not resisting but simply choosing, continuously and without effort, to be somewhere other than where the blade is. She drove a force push at him, shoulder height, enough force to crack a stone wall. He turned it, not absorbed it, not braced against it, turned it, redirected the energy in a smooth arc that bled it sideways into the rock formation beside them. A section of the formation's outer face cracked and fell away in a dry cascade. She was breathing hard now. He was not. She planted her feet and reached into the force to probe him, to find the fault line, the fear, the weakness that every living thing carried and that she had learned, across 10 years, to locate and press until it gave way. She reached into the mind of a 9-year-old boy. The lake she found had no bottom. It was still in the way that only things of enormous depth are still. Not the stillness of empty water, but the stillness of water that goes down so far that nothing disturbs its surface from below. Ancient, patient, she reached for its edges and found none. She reached for its center and found it was everywhere. And from that depth, something looked back at her. Not with assessment, not with threat, but with the particular quality of attention given to someone who is known, completely, without judgment. It looked at her, and it saw the temple corridor. It saw the clones turning. It saw a face she would not think the name of because she had learned across 10 years that thinking the name made the vision come, and the vision made her hands shake, and her hands could not shake because she was all she had. The face, the serene and terrible face above the blade, the floor, the children who did not understand. She gasped. The force probe collapsed. Her knees hit the sand. The red saber blades were still burning, horizontal and useless at her sides. She was on both knees in the sand in front of a barefoot child, and she did not know how she had gotten there. The boy crouched in front of her, eye level. His face carried no triumph and no pity, just that same unbearable steadiness. You survived because you refused to die. His voice was quiet and entirely direct. That is real strength. But you have been carrying that wound as a weapon for so long that you have forgotten what it felt like before the infection. Her jaw was clenched tight enough to hurt. You don't know what I'm carrying. He did not raise his voice. I know exactly what you are carrying. I know who put it there, and I know what you are planning to do with it, because I have seen the end of that plan, and it does not free you." He paused. "It makes you into him." The saber staff extinguished itself in her hand. She had not chosen to close her fist. The Force had simply declined to sustain the blade for the moment. She looked at him, this impossible, barefoot child kneeling in the Junland sand, and every professional mechanism she had built across a decade of hunting and surviving and refusing to feel anything that would slow her down ran directly into the wall of being seen this completely, and stopped. "The Force did not bring me here to prevent your revenge," Luke said. "It brought me here to offer you a different ending." He held her eyes without flinching. "Darth Vader is not Anakin Skywalker. Anakin Skywalker was a person who was broken and rebuilt into a weapon by a man who understood exactly which fears to press and exactly when to press them. Vader is the weapon, not the person." He let that sit. "What was done to you and to the others in that temple was done by Palpatine, using Anakin Skywalker as the instrument. Killing the instrument does not end the composer." She said nothing. The silence was not empty. It was full, pressing at the edges. "Go home," he said. "Survive. Stay alive long enough for the galaxy to change, because it is going to change, and it will need people who chose to heal over people who chose to burn." He stood, unhurried. "This hunt was never sanctioned. No one on Coruscant knows you are here. Leave Tatooine, and this morning does not have to be anything other than a morning you chose differently." He turned his back on her and walked toward the cave entrance. The sound of his footsteps in the sand, quiet, even, unhurried, she remained on her knees in the clearing. Her saber staff lay across her thighs, cold and dark. The twin suns pressed down on the formation walls, and the sand and the small scattered debris where the rock face had given way. She looked at the mark the redirected force push had left in the stone. A clean, structural fracture, the kind that required significant and precise energy to produce. From the inside of the cave, nothing moved. No sound. No additional presence in the Force. Just the boy, somewhere in the shadow behind the windcloth, no longer watching her. She stayed on her knees for a long time. When she finally rose, she did not look back at the cave entrance. She walked south through the passage between the formations. Her shuttle was 3 kilometers south-southwest, where she had set it down on a flat shelf of rock above the sand line. She walked at the pace of someone who was not running from anything. The sun climbed. The sand held her footprints for a while, and then the wind came across the wastes from the northwest, and then it didn't. The decision did not arrive dramatically. It arrived the way most true decisions arrive, not as a thunderclap, but as a recognition, a finally naming of something already known. Luke was sitting at the cave entrance in the pre-dawn dark, 3 days after Reva had walked south through the passage and not returned, and he was listening to the wastes settle into the cold quiet of deep night. And he understood with the complete clarity of a man who had spent 53 years learning the difference between postponement and readiness, that he had been postponing this, not because he didn't know it was coming. He had known since the moment he opened his eyes in the sand behind the homestead. He had known the way you know a bill will come due, the date uncertain, the amount fixed. He had been postponing it because he knew what their faces would look like. He sat with that for a while, in the dark, with the wastes breathing around him. Then he stood, went inside, and told Obi-Wan they would be leaving within the week. Obi-Wan, who had been awake, he was often awake before dawn now, meditating in the open way Luke had taught him, his Force presence warm, and reaching outward with a confidence that had been entirely absent 5 weeks ago, looked at the boy for a moment. Then he nodded once, with the clean finality of a man who had already done his own accounting and arrived at the same conclusion. "The homestead first," Luke said. "Of course," Obi-Wan said. He went alone. Obi-Wan had offered to come, and Luke had declined without explaining why, and Obi-Wan had accepted the declination without pressing it, which was itself evidence of how much things had changed. The man who had arrived on Tatooine 9 years ago, trailing the wreckage of a shattered order and a shattered self, would have pressed. The man sitting cross-legged in the cave entrance now, watching Luke walk south into the early light, simply watched and held his peace. The walk from the cave to the homestead took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Luke had timed it twice in previous weeks, without intending to, simply because he had the kind of mind that noticed duration. The terrain was familiar now in the way that repeated crossing makes terrain familiar, not just the landmarks, but the texture, the way the sand changed composition at the second ridge. the spot where a natural windbreak created a pocket of relative cool even in the afternoon heat. He arrived at the homestead as the twin suns cleared the eastern horizon, and the yard was still in the long, gold-angled light that made everything look briefly ancient and chosen. Owen was in the yard. Of course he was. Owen Lars was always in the yard at this hour, had been in the yard at this hour every morning of Luke's childhood, without exception, beginning whatever repair or modification or inspection had placed itself at the top of the day's operational list. This morning he was crouched beside a speeder bike, a panel removed, his hands already dark with lubricant, his attention on the machine with the focused quiet of a man who was most himself when he had something concrete to fix. He heard Luke coming and looked up. He assessed the boy's face with the sideways calibrating efficiency he'd always used, the kind that collected information without appearing to ask for it. "Early," Owen said. "Yes," Luke said. "I need to talk to you and Aunt Beru together, when you have a moment." Owen looked at him for a beat longer than the words required. Then he lowered his tools to the ground and stood and wiped his hands on the cloth tucked into his belt, without looking at it, a gesture so automatic it had been worn smooth by 20 years of repetition. "Now's fine," he said. Beru was at the kitchen counter when they came in, both hands wrapped around a cup, watching the morning light come through the narrow window above the prep surface. She turned when she heard them, her expression moving from the particular settled quiet of early morning into something more alert, not alarm, but the focused attention of a woman who had learned to read the quality of footsteps. She looked at Luke's face. Her cup went down on the counter. "Sit down," she said to both of them. They sat. The table between them was exactly as Luke had memorized it in the long years he'd spent carrying this specific rectangle of surface in the part of his mind where the irreplaceable things were kept. The worn place near Owen's position, the faint circular mark where a heat source had been set down without a stand sometime in the homestead's history, long before Luke was born. Beru's cup, Owen's hands flat on the surface, knuckles still faintly dark with lubricant at the creases. Luke looked at both of them. He had composed this conversation a dozen times across the past weeks, arranged the words in different orders, tested different openings against what he knew of them, tried to find the version that would be easiest for Owen to receive and clearest for Beru to carry afterward. He had arrived at the conclusion that there was no easy version, and that manufacturing one would be a kind of disrespect to people who had spent their entire lives being honest with a hard world. He said, "I have to leave." The kitchen held the words for a moment. "Not the homestead for the day," he continued. "Not for a week. For a long time. Possibly years." He kept his eyes on Owen, because Owen was the weight-bearing structure of this conversation and he knew it. "I need you to understand that I know what you've given me, both of you. I know every morning, and every meal and every repair, and every year of keeping me here and keeping me safe. I know the cost of that, and I know why you paid it, and I need you to know that I do not take a single day of it lightly." Owen's jaw had set in the way it set when he was processing something he intended to push back against. His eyes were on the table surface. Luke continued, "You kept me here because you knew what the galaxy does to people who reach for something beyond what they can hold. You watched it happen to someone you loved." He did not name Anakin. He did not need to. He felt Owen's hands press flat against the table. "You were right to try, and I understand completely, why you looked at me and decided that this boy was not going to be used up the way that happened before." Owen looked up. His face was doing several things, none of them the face he used in the yard or at market or in any of the contexts where Owen Lars had practiced, across a lifetime, the presentation of a man who required nothing from anyone. "You're 9 years old," Owen said. The same words Obi-Wan had used, carrying the same weight, but in Owen's voice they carried something additional. Not argument, not denial, but the raw, specific grief of a man saying out loud that the math does not work, that 9 years old is not an age that should require this conversation. "I know," Luke said. "I know I am asking you to do is not a thing that makes ordinary sense." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend that I'm simply a boy, Uncle Owen. You've known for weeks that I'm not simply a boy. I've seen you watching me." A silence. Outside, the wind moved across the homestead's outer surface in its low, continuous way. Owen said nothing, but the argument had gone out of his posture. Not defeated, nothing in Owen Lars was ever defeated, but resolved, settled, the internal accounting completed, and the column totaled. Luke recognized it. He had inherited, from this man, the same capacity for reaching a conclusion and then living cleanly inside it, rather than arguing with it indefinitely. Luke said, "You come back when you can." He used Owen's own cadence for it, the exact rhythm of it, because it was the truest sentence available. "That's all I need you to say." Something moved across Owen Lars's face that he would not have named and did not need to. He cleared his throat. He looked at the table. He looked briefly at Luke. And what was in his eyes in that moment was not the sideways calibrating assessment he used on the yard and the market and every surface presentation of his life. It was direct and unguarded and everything he had never been built to say aloud. "You come back when you can," Owen said. It landed the way he had known it would. Complete. Beru wept without apology, which was its own kind of courage, and held Luke against her chest with both arms the way she had always done. The grip of someone who understood exactly what holding was worth and did not ration it. He let her. He pressed his face against the fabric of her shoulder, and he memorized the specific warmth of her, the smell of the soap she used, the sound of her breathing, the way her hand moved in the slow circles across his back that she had done since he was an infant, and had never stopped doing because it was not a gesture she chose, it was a gesture she simply was. She made him food to carry. She did this without being asked, moving to the counter with the natural efficiency of someone for whom nourishment was a primary language. She wrapped it in cloth and pressed the small bundle into his hands, and then held his hands with it between both of hers. "Wait," she said, and went to the shelf above the sleeping area and came back with something small in her fist. She opened her hand. A metal medallion, worn smooth at the edges, carrying a family mark Luke recognized from the photographs that no longer existed in the timeline he had come from. She pressed it into his palm and closed his fingers around it. "My mother's," she said. She said it was for keeping. Her voice was steady and wet. "You keep it." He did not let her see his face for a moment. He looked down at the medallion in his small hand, and he let it be what it was, and he did not reach for control of what he felt. "You are the warmest person I have ever known," he said, when he looked up. She held his face between her palms, both hands, the specific gesture he had been waiting for without knowing it, the one he had carried for 50 years without being able to name exactly what he was carrying. "Strange boy," she said. "Strange and wonderful." She pressed her lips to his forehead and held them there for a moment, and then released him. He went to the entrance, he turned at the threshold and looked back once. Owen stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand on the frame, Beru beside him, her arms crossed, her eyes bright. The twin suns threw their light through the west-facing opening, and it fell across them both in a long, warm bar that did not know and did not care that it was the last morning. Luke raised his right hand. Owen raised his. Nothing more was said. Nothing more was needed. The gesture was as complete and permanent as anything spoken, more permanent than most things spoken. The kind of exchange that does not require language because it already contains everything language is trying to reach. Luke turned into the desert. He did not look back. The cave was packed and ready. Obi-Wan stood at the entrance with 2 bedrolls strapped to a carry frame, a provision kit, a navigation folio, and the particular expression of a man who had been waiting in the way someone waits, who has, finally, after a long time, somewhere worth going. He looked at Luke. He took in whatever was in Luke's face without comment. "Ready?" he said. Luke put on his cloak, the smaller one, the one Beru had hemmed to fit a 9-year-old's frame, the stitching at the shoulders made with the close, careful work of someone who paid attention to what they were holding. He felt the medallion against his sternum where he had placed it inside the inner pocket. He felt the force move through the desert morning in its old, enormous, unhurried way. "I've been ready for 53 years, he said. "Let's go." 3 years carved themselves out of the galaxy's indifference in the way that meaningful years always do, not loudly, not with ceremony, but through the slow accumulation of small moments that only reveal their weight in retrospect. They moved through the outer rim as a merchant and his ward. Obi-Wan traded dried goods, occasionally mechanical parts, once an entire shipment of reclaimed speeder components that a salvage operator on Florum had been trying to move for 8 months. He haggled with the practiced disinterest of a man who did not need the credits badly enough to appear to need them, which meant he almost always got what he wanted. Luke sat beside him at market tables and said very little and watched everything, which is an extremely effective way to learn the texture of a world. His body aged, slowly, steadily, the way bodies insist on aging regardless of what occupies them, 9 became 10, became 11, became 12. The frame lengthening in increments, the hands gaining fractional reach. He was 12 now, which meant his force capacity had increased with the physical growth, the vessel slightly larger, and therefore slightly more capable of holding what it contained. Not dramatically, he was still working within constraints that a full-grown body would not have imposed, but the progress was real. Obi-Wan recovered. This was the thing that mattered most in those 3 years, the thing that Luke measured with more care than any other variable. The force presence that had been a flinching, contracted ember when Luke first found it in the Jundland wastes had expanded month by month into something that approached what Obi-Wan Kenobi had been before Order 66, not identical, because you do not live through what he lived through, and return identical, but whole in the essential way. He had relearned the open meditation. He had relearned the fluid footwork. He had, approximately 3 months after they left Tatooine, in a quiet moment on a mid-rim transit stop, heard Qui-Gon Jinn's voice for the first time. He had not told Luke immediately. He had gone still and very pale, and then gone somewhere private for an hour. When he came back, his eyes were red, and his force presence was the brightest Luke had felt it, a clear flame rather than a dim one, burning straight up in clean air. He had said, "He says hello." Luke had said, "I know, he's been saying it for a while." They had not discussed it further. Some things do not require discussion. The contact with Leia continued. Twice a month, Luke found his stillness and made the crossing, and she was always waiting, not literally, not with the patience of someone who had been sitting still, but with the readiness of someone whose life was full and engaged, and who had learned to carry the connection the way you carry something important in a pocket, present, accessible, not consuming. She was 12 now, sharper than ever. The mental shield he had built with her in that first contact had become, over 3 years of daily practice, a structure of such solidity that Luke occasionally tested its edges during their sessions, and found nothing yielded. Her force sensitivity was developing quietly beneath the surface of her entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary life as Leia Organa's daughter and apprentice political mind. She asked him once, in the 2nd year, whether he was ever going to tell her what he wasn't telling her. He said yes. She said when. He said when they met in person. He said he was aware of that. She made the force equivalent of a sound she'd inherited from a father she'd never met, a compressed and pointed exhalation that communicated an entire paragraph of opinion in a single breath, and then she moved on. She always moved on. He loved her for it, every time. Ilum was white from space. The planet turned slowly in the viewport as the shuttle descended through the upper atmosphere, a sphere wrapped in cloud and ice, the polar winds visible at the terminator line as a continuous slow boil. Luke watched it grow and felt the planet's force signature clarify as the distance closed. Ancient, crystalline, with the deep harmonic resonance of a place that had been a site of sacred significance for so long that the significance had become geological. "The Empire's extraction operation is on the far hemisphere," Luke said, "southeast of the original temple site by approximately 40 kilometers. They won't be active this far north." "You've studied the architectural surveys," Obi-Wan said, from the pilot's seat. "I memorized the sacred texts that included the original survey maps during the years at the Academy." He paused, then added, "My Academy. Later, it's a long explanation." Obi-Wan had, over 3 years, developed a specific expression for the moments when Luke referenced the future. A slight narrowing of the eyes, combined with a deliberate not asking, the face of a man who had decided that the information would arrive when it was meant to, and that pressing would not accelerate the arrival. He wore that expression now. He landed the shuttle in a canyon below the temple's northern face. The cold hit immediately when the ramp descended. Not Tatooine cold, not the thin, dry chill of a desert night, but the full weight of a polar world asserting itself. The kind of cold that exists at a depth and has opinions about the presence of living things. Luke pulled his cloak and walked. The temple's outer structure had suffered. The Empire's presence on the planet, even 40 kilometers distant, seemed to have cast something over the surrounding landscape. A dullness, a weight, the particular quality of a place where something had been taken that had no intention of giving itself back. But the passage Luke was looking for was not in the outer structure. It was below it, carved into the planetary rock before the temple above was built, older than the order that had used it for 10,000 years. He found the entrance behind a fall of ice that had partially sealed it. He moved the ice with the force, Not dramatically, just a steady lateral pressure applied until the blockage shifted and the passage opened. Cold air sighed outward from the dark below. He turned to Obi-Wan. "I go alone from here," he said. "Tradition." Obi-Wan looked at the passage. He looked at Luke. "How long?" "However long it takes." He pulled a small light from his belt and held it. "The passage is single file for the first 100 meters, then opens. You'll hear me if anything goes wrong." "Will anything go wrong?" Luke considered this with genuine care. "No," he said. Obi-Wan stepped back from the entrance and clasped his hands behind him in the posture of a man prepared to wait with dignity. "I'll be here." Luke went down. The first 100 meters were exactly as described. The passage was narrow and cold, the walls close enough on both sides that his shoulders nearly brushed them. The floor cut in uneven steps that descended in a long spiral. His light caught the embedded kyber shards in the wall as he moved. Small fragments, not the grown crystals of the caves below, but the incidental scatter of a place that had been saturated with crystal-forming energy for geological time. Each fragment threw his light back in a slightly different color. The combined effect was a passage that seemed to breathe with faint light as he moved through it. He extinguished his own light at the 80-meter mark. He did not need it anymore. The caves below were self-illuminating, the grown crystals carrying their own faint blue radiance, enough to navigate by. He descended the last 20 meters in the crystal light and stepped out into the cathedral. No other word for it. The cave system opened into a space large enough to lose the ceiling in the crystal radiance. The walls receding into distances his eyes could only estimate. Every surface was encrusted, floor, walls, vaulted ceiling lost in blue-white glow, with kyber crystals in every stage of growth, from hairline filaments to columns the size of ancient trees. The sound they produced was not quite sound. It was a harmonic, felt more in the chest and the bones than heard through the ears, a chord of such complexity and depth that trying to isolate individual notes in it was like trying to separate water from rain. Luke stood at the entrance of the cathedral and let it meet him. The trial came without announcement. There was no physical change, no darkening, no obvious signal. One moment he was standing in the crystal chamber looking at the formations. The next, the formations were still there, and he was also somewhere else. Crate. Red salt beneath white crust, his feet cutting through the surface with each step, leaving the red tracks that the Resistance's ski speeders had cut across the flats before them. The full weight of the Resistance dying behind him in the old base, the walkers closing every variable resolved against survival. His hands empty, no lightsaber, nothing between the First Order's full military force and the last people who believed the galaxy could be different. He held it. He did not look away from it. The cave showed him Ben Solo's face across the burning temple. The specific geometry of that night, orange light, the sound of fire and old wood, the arc of a rising weapon, and his own face in the moment before he made the choice, he would spend years trying to understand. It showed him the students who had not made it out of that temple, their force presences extinguished in seconds, each one a light he had been responsible for and had failed to shelter. He held that too. He had done his grieving for these things. Not finished grieving. Grief of this scale does not finish. It simply becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you. But he had done the work of it across years, across the long and quiet days on Achto before the girl arrived, across the meditations where he had made himself look directly at what he had contributed to and had not flinched away and had not sought absolution from anyone but the Force itself, and found there neither absolution nor condemnation, but only the steady, ancient presence of a universe that continued regardless. He accepted the visions. He accepted the grief they carried. He breathed in and held them, and breathed out and released them, not into distance, not into denial, but into the same still place where Obi-Wan's tears in the cave had gone, where the sound of Beru's voice saying strange and wonderful had gone, where everything he had loved and lost lived now in the permanent archive of what had been real. The cave found nothing left to use. The silence that followed was absolute and complete, the silence of a space that has finished speaking and is now simply present. The crystal revealed itself, not hidden, not guarded by some secondary trial or locked behind a door of additional suffering. It sat on a natural shelf of ice at precisely his eye level, a grown column roughly the length of his forearm, glowing with a steady and specific green that was the color of every lightsaber Luke Skywalker had ever held. As though it had grown to this size and then stopped, waiting. as though the waiting had been the work. He crossed the cave floor and lifted it from the shelf with both hands. It spoke to him the way kyber crystals speak, not in language but in resonance, a harmonic alignment between the crystal's specific frequency and his own force signature, the two of them recognizing each other the way two notes recognize a chord. He held it and closed his eyes and listened to what it knew. Then he sat cross-legged on the crystal floor and got to work. The components came from his carry pack, salvaged and gathered across months of deliberate collection, assembled without fanfare from the secondary markets of 6 different outer rim systems, each piece chosen for purpose rather than aesthetics. He set them around himself in a ring and released them into the Force's attention. The assembly was slow, not because it was difficult, though it required a precision that would have been impossible for most practitioners, but because it deserved its pace. Each component rose and found its orientation, the internal geometry of the hilt resolving itself in the air between his open hands, with the patient logic of something that could only be assembled correctly one way, and that had been waiting for someone with the knowledge to find that way. The emitter matrix, the energy gate, the focusing ring, the power cell, seated and sealed, the kyber crystal last, lowered into the housing with a care that bordered on ceremony. The final component sealed, the crystal seated, the hilt hung in the air in front of him, still and complete. He reached out and held it. The blade ignited, green, steady, clean. The crystal light of the cave caught it and threw it back in 1,000 reflected shards across every surface, until the whole cathedral was alive with green light and blue radiance, and the deep kyber harmonic climbing to meet the blade's frequency and resolving, together, into a chord that the cave's 10,000-year history had never exactly heard before. He sat with it for a moment. Then he extinguished the blade and rose and walked back toward the passage. Obi-Wan was where he had left him, standing at the cave entrance in the polar cold, hands behind his back, his breath visible. He turned when Luke emerged. His eyes went immediately to the hilt in Luke's hand, and his face did something complicated and quiet. He took it when Luke offered it. He turned it over with the unhurried attention of a man examining a thing he wants to understand fully. He examined the construction, the tolerances, the crystal housing seal. "In 40 years of Jedi training," he said, "I have never seen anyone construct a saber without a workbench." He looked at Luke. "I have never seen it done like this." Luke took it back, gently. "It's in the ancient texts." He clipped the hilt to his belt. "Most of the Order never had reason to learn it." He looked up at the white sky, at the slow turning of Ilum's clouds above the canyon walls. "Time to go to Alderaan." Obi-Wan let out a breath that was almost a laugh, not from amusement, but from the recognition that after 3 years of preparing and traveling and recovering and rebuilding, the next thing was finally here. "Yes," he said, "I imagine it is." Alderaan came through the viewport like a held breath finally released. Luke stood at the shuttle's observation window and watched the planet clarify as the distance closed. The cloud cover first, brilliant white against the black. Then the suggestion of green and gray beneath it. Then the full resolution of a world that had been constructed, over millennia, on the premise that beauty was not a luxury but a form of governance. The mountains visible from orbit. The river systems cutting their patient paths through the lowland valleys. The cities built at the scale of the landscape rather than against it, pale and deliberate, each one positioned as though the planet had considered where it should go and then decided. He had seen this from orbit once before. He had been standing in a different vessel, in a different year, watching this planet exist for the last seconds of its existence, and he had felt through the Force the precise moment it ceased to. The screaming absence of 1 billion lives extinguished so quickly the Force couldn't register the individual losses, only the totality of them. A wound in the living galaxy so large that Jedi across the outer rim had reported feeling something wrong without knowing what. He pressed his hand flat against the viewport glass. He had the foreknowledge to prevent that. The Death Star's structural weakness, the political chain that led to its construction and deployment, the specific moment in the timeline where a different choice would change the outcome, he carried all of it, and it was what the next chapters of his life were for. He would not watch this planet die twice. He let his hand fall from the glass and went to sit beside Obi-Wan for the descent. Bail Organa received them in a private garden. Not a formal reception hall, not a stateroom with its protocol and its observed distances. A garden, tucked into the palace's inner face, surrounded on 3 sides by stone walls covered in climbing plants whose small white flowers had no function except to be exactly what they were: a table of plain stone, 3 chairs, no servants, no aides, no guards visible, though Luke was aware of 2 security personnel stationed at the garden's single entrance with the careful invisibility of professionals. Bail Organa was a man who occupied physical space with the particular quality of someone who had spent their entire adult life ensuring that the quality of their presence was a choice rather than a default. He was not tall, not imposing in the ordinary physical sense, but he arranged himself with the precision of someone who understood that how you sat and where you looked and what you did with your hands were political acts as much as any speech or vote. He had a senator's face, warm by training, intelligent by nature, and underneath both, the specific, guarded alertness of a man who had been making calculations about who to trust for 20 years and had survived by being right more often than wrong. He studied Luke with an attention he made no effort to conceal. Obi-Wan's message, he said, was characteristically sparse. He told me you were coming, that you required privacy, and that what you had to say was worth hearing. He looked at the boy across the table with the direct, measuring quality of a man whose entire professional life had been organized around the reading of other people. He also said that you were not entirely what you appeared to be. That's accurate, Luke said. How old are you? 12, Luke said, and 53. Both of those numbers are simultaneously correct, and I'll explain them if you want the explanation. But the explanation is long, and I think the more efficient use of this meeting is what I've come to tell you. He paused. Senator Organa, the Galactic Senate has at most 4 years before it becomes entirely ceremonial. Palpatine will dissolve it. He will replace it with direct imperial governance, administered through regional governors reporting exclusively to him. When he does, the last institutional mechanism for organized resistance will be gone, and the people who understand what has been lost will be scattered and without coordination. Bail was very still. I know this, Luke continued, because I have seen it happen. I also know that you have already begun, carefully, slowly, through networks you have been building for years, the infrastructure of what will eventually become an organized resistance. I know the names. I know the nodes. I know where the networks are strongest and where they are exposed. He looked at Bail steadily. I am not here to take over that work or redirect it. I'm here to give you information that will make it more likely to succeed. A silence occupied the garden. The climbing plants moved slightly in a small wind that came over the top of the eastern wall. Somewhere further in the palace, a door opened and closed. Bail Organa looked at Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan met his eyes with the expression of a man who had spent 3 years watching this child operate, and had arrived at a very specific and considered position on the question of credibility. Bail looked back at Luke. What kind of information? He said. They talked for 3 hours. Luke laid it out with the systematic care of a man who had spent a great deal of time deciding exactly what to share and in what order. Not everything. He was precise about what he withheld and why. Because information delivered out of sequence to the wrong people could accelerate the exact outcomes he was trying to prevent. And because Bail Organa was a man intelligent enough to handle the truth, but wise enough to know that too much of it at once was its own kind of danger. He told Bail about the Death Star. Not every technical specification, but enough. The scale of it, the timeline, the specific political decision-making chain that had made it possible. He told him that the project was already underway, further advanced than any Senate intelligence asset would currently report, and that the people responsible for its construction had been chosen precisely because they had no loyalty to any institution except the one that was paying them. He told him about Order 66's command structure, that the clone inhibitor chips were organic and had been in place since the clone's embryonic development, that they could not be removed without specialized medical knowledge that the Empire had systematically suppressed, that the few Jedi who had survived Order 66 were being hunted with a systematic thoroughness that would eliminate them as an organized force within a decade, unless they were actively sheltered and coordinated. He gave Bail 3 names of surviving Jedi whose locations he knew within operational margin. He described the network vulnerabilities in the nascent rebellion's supply chain. 2 specific points where Imperial intelligence had already positioned observation assets. He watched Bail's face change as each piece of information landed, the warmth not leaving it exactly but going deeper, going beneath the politician's surface into the place where Bail Organa, the man rather than the senator, made his assessments. How do I verify any of this? Bail said, eventually. You don't, Luke said. Not immediately. But within the next 6 months, 3 of the things I've told you will become independently verifiable through your existing intelligence networks. After that, your verification threshold for the rest will be your own decision. Bale absorbed this. He turned his cup. He had ordered tea at the 2-hour mark, the first concession to ordinary comfort in the entire conversation, and looked at the table. You're asking me to operate on faith, he said. I'm asking you to make an informed decision about risk, Luke said, which is what you do every day in the Senate. The only difference is the source. Bale looked at this 12-year-old boy across a garden table on a warm Alderaan afternoon and made a decision with his eyes. Not announced, not narrated. He simply looked, and then something settled in his posture, and then he reached for his cup and drank from it. All right, he said. Leia arrived late. That was the word Luke would have used if he'd described it to someone who didn't know her. Arrived as though she were an event rather than a person, which was accurate. She came through the garden entrance with the momentum of someone who had been somewhere else entirely until 30 seconds ago, and had redirected their full velocity toward this location. A navigation folio under one arm and a look on her face that said she had been told a meeting was happening in her home that she had not been told about and had decided to address this situation directly. She was 12 years old. She was wearing the practical indoor clothes of a girl who had been doing something that mattered to her, her dark hair pulled back impatiently, and she moved through the garden with the physical confidence of someone who inhabited their own space with complete authority. She stopped when she saw Luke. He watched her face. He had prepared for this. He had thought about it across months of anticipation, the moment when the voice from across the stars became a person in a garden chair, when the Force bond became a pair of eyes looking at him from 3 meters away. He had thought he was prepared for it. He had not been entirely prepared for it, because she looked at him with immediate recognition, not intellectual recognition, not the working out of a conclusion, but the bone-level recognition of something the body knows before the mind has organized the knowing, and her face went through 3 things in the space of 2 seconds, none of them available to description. And then she said, in a voice stripped of every performance, "You're him." Not a question, a conclusion. Yes, Luke said. She stared at him for another moment. Then she looked at Obi-Wan, who she had not met before, but whose Force presence she had felt in Luke's transmissions, and recognized now with the precise identification of someone who had been paying attention for 3 years. She looked at her father, who gave her a small nod that said, "Yes, sit down. This is real." She sat down. She put her navigation folio on the table with the deliberate calm of someone managing a significant internal experience through the application of external order. She looked back at Luke. "You're going to explain all of it now," she said. "Yes," he said, "starting with the part you've been not telling me for 3 years. Starting with that." She held his eyes with the fierce, level attention he had known for decades from the other side of a Force bond, and that was, in person, across 3 meters of Aldarian afternoon. The most familiar thing he had encountered in 3 years of a world that was still, in most ways, new. "We're twins," he said. The garden was quiet. The white flowers on the eastern wall moved in the small wind. Leia Organa sat across the table from her brother for the first time and said nothing for a long moment. He watched her process it, not with denial, not with the defensive skepticism she deployed against things that threatened her existing framework, but with the open and rapid integration of someone taking in a truth that explained a very long list of things that had previously required individual explanations. When she spoke, she did not say "that's impossible" or "how do you know" or any of the other available sentences that would have spent time on the wrong thing. She said, "Our parents. Our mother was a senator," Luke said. "She died shortly after we were born. Our father is alive. He is not accessible to us yet. He may be, eventually." He held her eyes carefully, carrying the weight of the next sentence the way you carry something fragile. "Our father became someone the galaxy needed to be protected from. That is not a permanent condition, but it is the present one." Leia sat with this. She looked at the table and she looked at Bale, her father, the one who had chosen her and raised her and loved her with the complete, deliberate commitment of a man who understood that love was a practice rather than a feeling. And then she looked back at Luke. And whatever she found in his face satisfied whatever question she was asking, because she drew one slow breath and let it out and straightened. "What do you need me to do?" she said. He felt the Force move through the garden with the quality it had at these moments, not dramatically, not with the language of the sacred texts, but with the simple, enormous current of a river that has finally found the channel it was meant to run in. For now, he said, just what you've been doing. Be exactly who you are. He paused. The galaxy is going to need it. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then, with the compressed economy of someone who had already decided that this was real, and was now simply managing how to carry it forward. All right, she said. She picked up the navigation folio. She looked at her father. I assume, she said, that we have a great deal more to discuss. We do, Bale said. She stood. She looked at Luke once more across the table, the twin sons opposite, the same eyes and a different face, the Force bond becoming in the physical world something that required no transmission and no distance at all. Tomorrow, she said, you're going to teach me what Obi-Wan taught you. It was not a question. Yes, Luke said. She nodded, once, and walked back through the garden entrance with the same momentum she had arrived with, already thinking forward. Luke watched her go, and felt the Force settle around the moment with the particular permanence of things that have just become true. She's always been like this, Bale said quietly from across the table. I know, Luke said. She comes by it honestly. Bale looked at him for a moment with an expression that was many things at once. Relief, wonder, the grief of a man who had loved a woman he could not save, and was sitting across a table from the evidence that something she had made had survived and grown into this. And then he looked away, and cleared his throat, and reached for his cup. The garden held them all in the afternoon light. Tython took 3 weeks to reach from Alderaan. The route was not direct. Nothing about this stage of the plan permitted direct routes. They moved through 4 intermediate systems, each one chosen for the specific quality of its traffic, busy enough to absorb a merchant shuttle without remark, quiet enough that an Imperial observation post would have no reason to flag their transponder. Obi-Wan flew. Luke sat in the co-pilot's seat and watched the hyperspace tunnel and ran the calculation for the 100th time, checking its architecture for the flaw he hoped wasn't there. The plan was surgical. It required Vader to come to a specific location at a specific time drawn by a specific signal. It required that signal to be large enough to reach him across whatever distance separated them, which meant Luke needed Tython's seeing stone, the Vergence Point, the ancient Force hinge that amplified a meditating Force sensitive's presence into a beacon detectable across the galaxy. It required Vader to come alone, or nearly alone, which meant the signal had to feel like a single Jedi, rather than a coordinated ambush, which meant Luke had to project the specific harmonic texture of a Jedi Master in deep meditation, rather than a 12-year-old boy constructing a trap. He could do that. He had been doing exactly that, projecting the textured Force presence of a trained adult, since Tatooine. The discipline of it was muscle memory now. What the plan could not guarantee was Vader's internal state when he arrived, whether it would be the warlord or the prisoner, whether 20 years of accumulated darkness would leave any gap at all for what Luke intended to do. He ran the calculation again and arrived at the same answer. Not certainty. Sufficient probability he had made decisions on less. You've gone quiet, Obi-Wan said, from the pilot's seat. I'm thinking. You've been thinking for 6 hours. It's a large thought. Obi-Wan looked at him sidelong. You're going to tell me what we're actually doing on Tython at some point before we land, I assume. Luke looked at the hyperspace tunnel. We're going to Tython to draw Vader to a specific location under controlled conditions, so that I can attempt to reach the person inside him before he kills either of us. A pause. The tunnel moved. I see, Obi-Wan said. I've done it before, Luke said, in a different timeline. It worked. You were presumably not 12 years old at the time. I was not. Obi-Wan's hands were very still on the controls. And if it doesn't work this time, Luke turned to look at him. Then we leave. Fast. Tython from above looked like a world in argument with itself. Half dense forest, half exposed stone plateau, the division between them abrupt and unmediated, as though the planet had simply decided, at some geological moment, to be 2 different things and hadn't bothered reconciling them. The Force signature of it was immediately apparent from low orbit, a concentration of cosmic Force energy so dense that it registered not as a presence, but as a pressure, the way a sound felt in the chest rather than heard through the ears. Luke felt it press against him through the hull, and recognized it with the same deep, bone-level familiarity with which he had recognized Leia's face across a garden table. He had sat on Tython's stone as an older man and seen his father's ghost. He had sat here and understood things about the Force that he had not understood anywhere else. It was, in ways that defied the ordinary vocabulary of place, the most significant patch of ground he had ever stood on. He was about to stand on it, as a child, to spring a trap on the most dangerous man in the galaxy. He adjusted his cloak and descended the ramp. The Force Henge was 2 hours' walk from the landing site, up a trail that climbed the plateau's eastern face in long, patient switchbacks. The stone underfoot was old, not old the way Tatooine was old, weathered and scoured, but old the way things are old when they have not been touched, and therefore have not been worn. Smooth in places where generations of feet had crossed it, rough everywhere else with the original grain of the rock. The structures at the summit came into view as he cleared the final switchback, standing stones arranged in a formation that had not been built by casual labor, their scale and placement deliberate in a way that spoke of an understanding of the Force so deep it had been worked into architecture. The seeing stone sat at the center, a low, flat surface of dark stone, the Force Virgins concentrated directly above it in a column of cosmic Force energy that Luke could see, not with his eyes, but with the same sense that let him see through walls and across star systems, the Force sight that a 12-year-old body had not diminished. He sat on the stone. He looked at Obi-Wan, who had walked the 2 hours without complaint, and now stood at the formation's outer edge with his hands behind his back, and his Force presence carefully neutral. "When it starts," Luke said, "stay out of his sensing range. As far as these stones will permit, don't reach into the Force at all. Nothing, not even the listening meditation. Flatten completely." Obi-Wan looked at him for a moment. The old Jedi's face carried something careful and enormous. "Luke." "Yes. Come back from this." Luke looked at him. He let the words land the way they deserved to land, with the full weight of what they meant from this particular man who had already lost everyone he had ever said them to. "I will," he said, and meant it completely. He closed his eyes. The meditation that followed was the most demanding thing he had done in this body. He did not project gently. He did not build gradually. He opened to the cosmic Force through the seeing stone's vergence point, and he poured his presence through it the way a signal is poured through a transmitter, fully, without reservation, with the specific harmonic texture of a Jedi Master in the deepest possible contemplation. The vergence amplified it. He felt the signal leave Tython's atmosphere and enter the galaxy's Force current and travel outward in every direction simultaneously, a beacon burning in the Force sky that any sensitive being within range would register as unmistakable and specific. The child's body objected immediately. He felt the trembling begin in his hands, felt the sweat at his temples, felt the particular draining fatigue of a vessel asked to carry more current than its circuits were rated for. He held it anyway. He had done this before under worse conditions, and he would hold it for as long as it required holding. He waited. 11 minutes passed. Then, from a direction he could not name in physical terms, not north, not above, but inward from the place in the Force where very large, very dark things existed, he felt it arrive. The presence of Darth Vader moved through the Force the way a wound moves through a body, not simply present, but radiating. The darkness around it not incidental, but structural, the product of 2 decades of systematic immersion in every technique the Sith tradition had developed for converting suffering into power. It was enormous. It was the largest dark side presence Luke had encountered in any of his lives, including the last time he had stood in a room with it. And inside it, buried so deep that only someone who knew precisely where to look would find it, a faint and specific warmth, like an ember at the center of a burned building, still there, still alive. Luke felt Vader feel the beacon, felt the attention turn, the full, vast, weaponized attention of the Emperor's enforcer orienting on a signal that registered in the Force as Jedi Master, felt the decision happen in an instant, without deliberation, because Vader in this era did not deliberate about Jedi. He moved. Luke held the signal and waited. The shuttle's descent was not announced. It came through the clouds on the far side of the plateau and landed 2 kilometers from the formation, and Luke felt Vader disembark before he heard anything. Felt the dark side presence move across the plateau's surface, toward the henge, with the direct, undeviating momentum of something that did not negotiate with terrain. He kept his eyes closed. He kept the beacon burning. Obi-Wan, at the formation's edge, had gone completely still in the Force, flat, invisible. Good. The footsteps arrived, the mechanical breathing, that specific, even rhythm, the respirator cycling with the inhuman patience of a machine, entered the stone formation and stopped. Silence. The Tython wind, the deep cosmic force pressing down through the Virgin's Point. Then, in a voice that Luke had heard in 1,000 different contexts, and that still carried even now, the buried harmonic of a person it had once belonged to, a child. Not contempt, not dismissal, something more disturbed than either. Luke opened his eyes. Vader stood at the formation's entrance, 12 meters away, his black armor absolute against the pale stone and the gray sky. The red lightsaber was not yet ignited. He was looking at the 12-year-old boy sitting cross-legged on the seeing stone, with the specific quality of attention a predator gives to something that should not exist. "Dad," Luke said. The word was very quiet. It carried no demand and no performance, and nothing strategic at all. It was simply the truest available word for what stood in front of him. The red blade extinguished. The sound of it going out was very small in the plateau's open air. The light it had been throwing across the standing stones simply stopped, and the gray Tython sky resumed sole occupancy of the color of things. Vader's hand, the right hand, the weapon hand, the one that had extinguished the blade, lowered to his side. Nothing moved. Then, from inside the armor, from the human chest inside the mechanical chest, a sound that the respirator could not process or regulate or modulate into anything other than what it was, a single rough exhale, broken in its middle. The sound of something that has been held for a very long time, releasing, in the only way that bodies know how. Luke stood with his hand on his father's arm, and did not speak, and did not let go. They stood on the plateau for a long time. Eventually Vader moved, not away, but down, the armor's systems responding to a decision Luke felt happen in the Force before it manifested physically, a decision to occupy the same level of the world rather than a different one. The black-armored figure lowered itself onto the plateau stone and sat, which was an act so quietly monumental that Luke stood looking at it for a moment before he sat as well, cross-legged, facing his father in the gray Tython light. "Palpatine will sense this," Vader said. His voice was still the respirator's voice, mechanical and immense, but something had left it that had been in it before, a particular quality of finality, of closed doors, that was no longer present. "Not yet," Luke said. "The Vergence here interferes with force sensing at distance. You have time." "How much?" "Enough." Luke looked at him. "I'm not asking you to declare yourself today. I'm not asking you to walk away from Palpatine at this moment. What I'm asking is smaller than that, and harder." Vader waited. "I'm asking you to stop believing that Anakin Skywalker deserves what has been done to him," Luke said. "That's the lock on the cell. Not Palpatine's power, not the suit, not the Emperor's hands, or his Inquisitors, or the entire Imperial Navy. The lock is that you believe you deserve to be in there." He held the masked face. "You don't. What you did in your grief and your fear, and your deliberate, sustained manipulation by the most powerful Sith Lord in galactic history, none of it makes you deserve a permanent cell. It makes you someone who has an enormous amount of work to do." He paused. "That is different. And the difference is everything." A long silence, the wind across the plateau, the distant sound of Tython's forests moving in the valley below. "The children," Vader said. Luke did not look away. "Yes. I cannot." The sentence stopped. The respirator cycled through the gap. "There is no accounting for that." "No," Luke said. "There isn't." He did not soften it or redirect it or offer comfort for it, because it was not a thing that could be comforted, and doing so would have been an insult to both of them. "And you will carry it. You will carry it for the rest of your life, however long that is, and it will never weigh less than it weighs now. But carrying it is different from being defined by it. Carrying it means you are still there to carry it, which means you can still do something with whatever time remains." He held his father's eyes through the mask. "There is a galaxy that is going to need saving. There are people who are going to die if you stay where you are. And there is a daughter you have never met who is already, at 12 years old, angrier and more capable than any 3 senators combined, and she is going to lead that saving whether she has her father's help or not. But I think you should meet her before you make any final decisions about who you are." Something changed in the force around Vader, not dramatically. Not with the clean, sudden transformation of a thing resolving into certainty, but something moved in the darkness, the ember Luke had been reading since the probe, and it moved toward the surface. and it stayed there. "You said I chose my son," Vader said. "On the Death Star. Yes. Over everything. Yes." The masked face was toward him. Behind it, Luke felt in the Force the specific and enormous effort of a man looking at a version of himself he had not visited in a very long time. Not with hope, because hope was still too far away. And not with acceptance, but with the first genuine consideration of the possibility that the prisoner and the prison were not the same thing. "Tell me," Vader said, "about your sister." Luke looked at his father on the ancient stone of Tython and felt the Force move around them both, with the quality it had always had at the moments that mattered most. Not dramatically, not with the crescendo that stories like to apply to turning points, but with the quiet, enormous patience of a universe that had been waiting a very long time for this particular conversation to happen. He told him. 6 months passed before Vader acted. Luke had not expected immediacy, he had not asked for it, and Vader had not offered it. And both of them understood, without negotiating the point, that the work of dismantling a 20-year Sith architecture from the inside required the patience of someone who had learned to move pieces across a very long board. Vader returned to his shuttle on the far side of the plateau, and Luke watched him go, and they did not make arrangements or establish contact protocols or any of the operational infrastructure of an alliance. Because what had happened on Tython's stone was not an alliance. It was something older and less formal than that. It was a door left open in a wall that had been sealed for 2 decades, and what moved through it would move in its own time. Luke returned to Alderaan. He continued his work with Bail. He continued his twice-monthly contact with Leia, who had absorbed the information about their parentage with the same compressed, forward-moving efficiency she brought to every truth that threatened to overwhelm her, and who had then, characteristically, redirected her energy entirely toward what it meant for the work rather than what it meant for her feelings. She would address the feelings later. She always addressed the feelings later. He continued his morning practice with Obi-Wan. In the palace gardens Bail had arranged for their use, the footwork and the Force evasion and the open meditation, and he watched Obi-Wan recover the remaining distance toward himself, the last reserves of the exile's damage filling in slowly with the patient material of resumed purpose. He waited. The signal arrived, not through the Force, but through a dead-drop communication node on Ryloth, a single encrypted package routed through 4 intermediary systems, the encryption keyed to a Force harmonic only Luke would recognize. He decrypted it with his eyes closed and 3 seconds of concentration. Inside, the technical specifications for Order 66's inhibitor chip removal procedure, medical grade, precise, annotated in Vader's own hand. Vader, who had spent 6 months in the Imperial Medical Archive, under the pretext of suit maintenance, reading everything, taking nothing that could be tracked, and then writing from memory what he had found. Luke sat with the document for a long time. Then he forwarded it to Bail Organa's most trusted medical operative with a single appended line: "Begin reaching the survivors." The second thing Vader sent took 3 more months. It was a list, names and coordinates, the locations of 7 Inquisitorius safe houses, the patrol routes of 3 active Inquisitor hunting teams, the identities of 4 Imperial intelligence assets embedded in nascent rebel cells that Bail's network had not detected. It was specific and current and organized, with the clean, thorough efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years inside the machine he was now quietly disassembling from within. Luke read it and thought about the person who had sat on Tython's stone and said, "I cannot," and meant it as the beginning of a sentence he was learning to finish differently. He thought about the Ember. He forwarded the list to Bail. The third thing Vader sent was not a document. It was himself. The meeting happened on a neutral station above Christophsis, a commercial waypoint chosen for its traffic density and the specific quality of its security gap, a 12-minute window in the station's external sensor rotation that Vader identified and communicated through the dead drop. Luke arrived with Obi-Wan. He did not tell Obi-Wan who they were meeting until they were on the station, which was a decision he had made deliberately and had not made lightly, and had made anyway because some conversations needed to be had in sequence rather than simultaneously. He told Obi-Wan in the docking corridor 2 minutes before the meeting. Obi-Wan went very still. "He's not who he was," Luke said. "He is also still who he is. Both of those things are true, and he is aware of both of them." Obi-Wan looked at the corridor wall for a moment. Then he looked at Luke. "And you believe it is safe." "I believe it is necessary," Luke said. "Which is a different kind of safe." Obi-Wan was quiet for a moment longer. Then he straightened, not the performance of composure, but the genuine article, the settling of a man into the full weight of his own purpose. He had come a long way from the cave in the Jundland wastes. He had come the full distance. "All right," he said. The room Vader had specified was a cargo inspection bay. Currently empty, its inspection cycle not due for 20 minutes. The lighting was functional and cold. The air smelled of transit, the generic neutral smell of a space that had held 10,000 different cargoes and retained the character of none of them. Vader was already there. He stood with his back to the entrance, facing the far wall, which was a habit Luke had not anticipated, and which he recognized, after a moment, as the architecture of a man who had decided not to make the other person feel cornered. A small and specific courtesy. Luke noted it the way he noted everything, completely, without assigning more weight than it warranted. Obi-Wan stopped 2 meters inside the door. The respirator cycled. The black armor did not turn immediately. Luke stood between them, which was not a calculation, and was entirely a calculation, and waited. Vader turned. The pale blue eyes behind the mask, the ones Luke felt through the Force, the ones that had once been a young man's eyes and that carried still the specific depth of someone who had felt everything life could offer and had paid the full price for every feeling. Those eyes moved from Luke to the man standing 2 meters behind him. Obi-Wan's face was doing what faces do when they have spent 20 years constructing a specific emotional architecture around a loss, and then the loss is standing in the room. Neither of them spoke. Luke took a small step to the side, clearing the line between them, and then he simply stood and let the silence be what it was, not a void to fill, not a failure of language, just the space two people needed to stand in when the distance between them was the entirety of 20 years. Obi-Wan said finally in a voice that was every version of itself at once, the master, the friend, the man who had held a dying teacher and a burning student and a galaxy that had ended, Anakin. Not Vader, not Lord Vader, not the title or the name the darkness had given him. The name his mother had chosen, standing in the Tatooine light with her hands on a small boy's face. In the year before everything, the respirator cycled. Something in the black armor's bearing changed. Not dramatically, not with the physical language of crisis, but in the way that enormous, structural things change when the first fissure opens in them. Not collapse, the beginning of a different kind of load-bearing. Obi-Wan, Vader said. 2 words, both names. The full distance between them, acknowledged, and the full history between them carried in exactly the syllables they occupied and no others. Luke stood very still, and did not move and did not reach into the Force, and did not attempt to manage what was happening between these 2 men, because it was not his to manage. He had brought them to the same room. What happened in the room was theirs. He watched his old master and his father look at each other across 20 years of a war that had started long before the last battle and would not end until long after it. And he felt the Force move through the space between them with the quality it reserved for moments that had been in preparation for a very long time. Not reconciliation, not absolution, not the clean surgical resolution that stories required. Something realer than all of that. Something that could live with everything that had happened, and everything that still needed to happen, and did not require the pretense that either of those categories was finished. They talked for 9 minutes. Luke heard almost none of it. He had moved to the far end of the bay, and was watching the corridor with his Force sense and his eyes, and was aware of the conversation happening behind him, the way he was aware of the kyber crystal in his lightsaber's housing. Present, fundamental, not something that needed monitoring. When the 9 minutes ended, Vader came to stand beside him at the bay's far wall. "She knows about me," he said. A statement, not a question. "She knows about Anakin Skywalker," Luke said carefully. "She knows what happened to him. She does not yet know that Darth Vader is what he became." A pause. The respirator. "Does she?" "She has already decided," Luke said. "I know her. She decided before she had all the information because that is how she makes every decision that matters. She decides first on the principle, and then acquires the evidence, and if the evidence challenges the principle, she fights the evidence until one of them wins." He looked at the wall. The principle she decided on was, "He is my father, and I have not met him yet." That is the whole of it for her. The rest is detail. Another pause, longer. "She is like her mother," Vader said, in a voice that the respirator could not entirely process. "Yes," Luke said. "She is." They stood at the far wall of the cargo inspection bay on a neutral station above Christopsis, and said nothing more for a moment. And the Force held them both in the particular quality of a present that had been built from a very long and very specific past. Then Vader said, "I will need time. I know. There are things I need to remove before I can." He stopped. "There are things inside the machine that cannot simply be walked away from. People who would be in danger. Vulnerabilities that Palpatine does not currently know exist, and which need to be addressed before he loses the use of me." "I know," Luke said. "Take the time you need. We are not going anywhere." He paused, and then he said one more thing, because it was true, and because Vader needed to hear it from him specifically rather than from anyone else. The galaxy is not going to be saved in a single action. It is going to be saved in 100 decisions made by 100 different people across years of work that most of them will never be recognized for. You are one of those people. The work you are doing from inside, it is already saving lives. It is already changing the shape of what is coming. He looked at his father directly. You are already your son's father. You have been making the choice since Tython. You just haven't known what to call it yet. Vader did not respond immediately. The respirator cycled in its even, patient rhythm. Then, "You are 12 years old." "I know," Luke said. "You have the Force signature of a Jedi Master. I know that too." The black armor was still for a moment. Then, from somewhere inside it, in the original voice rather than the processed one, fractional, barely present, the thinnest possible layer of something that had not been there 6 months ago, "He would have liked you." Luke looked at the wall. "I think he would have liked me," he said. "I think I would have liked him." The 12-minute window was almost up. Vader turned and walked to the bay's entrance. He stopped there for a moment, one hand on the doorframe, not looking back. "Tell your sister," he said, "that she comes by the stubbornness honestly." He left. Luke stood in the empty cargo bay and let the Force settle around the moment. And then he let the moment be finished, and he turned and walked back to where Obi-Wan was standing. Obi-Wan's face was the face of a man who has just done the hardest thing he had in him to do, and found that it was survivable. "All right," Luke said. Obi-Wan looked at him. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same neighborhood, the sound of a man releasing something that had been compressed inside him for 20 years, and finding, on the other side of the release, that there was still something left. "Getting there," he said. Luke nodded. He took one last look at the empty bay, the cold, functional light, the smell of 1,000 transient cargoes, the wall where 2 men had stood and said each other's names across 2 decades of everything, and then he walked out of it. The years that followed moved the way years do when there is work to fill them. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular density of time that has been used rather than spent. The rebellion grew. Not with the sudden dramatic momentum that Luke had watched in his first life, the desperate sprint from scattered cells to open warfare, but with the slower and more durable momentum of an organization that had been told which vulnerabilities to avoid and which contacts to trust and which Imperial intelligence plans to leave in place and feed carefully chosen information. Bail Organa worked with the precise, patient efficiency of a man who had been given the map to a maze he had been navigating blind for years. The cells expanded. The network deepened. The supply chains that had been exposed were rebuilt along different routes. Alderaan remained. Luke stood at Alderaa's viewport a dozen more times across those years, and watched the planet turn and felt it continue to exist and did not take a single orbit of it for granted. Leia grew. This was the thing that the work could not contain, and did not try to. The sheer fact of her, the velocity of her, the way she moved from 12 to 13 to 15 to 17, with the focused momentum of someone who understood that time was a resource, and had decided not to waste it. She became Bail's formal apprentice at 14. She addressed her first Senate hearing at 15, and was so comprehensively prepared that 3 senior senators had revised their positions before she finished her second point. She sat her first intelligence briefing at 16, and immediately identified 2 operational redundancies that Bail's network had not caught. Luke watched her become who she was, and felt the Force hum around her with the particular quality it had always had around people who were exactly where they were supposed to be. She asked about their father, across those years, with a regularity that told him she was processing rather than pressing, returning to the question the way a problem is returned, to each time with more information, each time from a slightly different angle. He gave her what he could, when he could. He did not give her everything at once, because he had learned from watching Bail handle intelligence that information delivered before its context is available is only partially received, and Leia deserved to receive this fully. He told her about Anakin Skywalker, the person before the Sith, the boy from Tatooine, the pilot, the husband, the man whose capacity for love had been the thing Palpatine had used to break him, and which had also, in the end, been the thing that had not broken. He told her about Padme Amidala. He told her the shape of the tragedy without yet naming the armor. She listened. She asked precise and careful questions. She took her time. The morning she was ready arrived the way readiness arrives. Not announced, not scheduled, but present in the quality of her Force signature when Luke found it through their bond, a particular settled openness that he had been watching for. He told her the rest. She was quiet for a long time after. They were in the palace garden, the same garden where they had first met, where Bail had drunk his tea and made his decision with his eyes, the climbing plants still on the eastern wall, the small white flowers still finding no reason not to be exactly what they were. She was 19 years old. She sat across the garden table from her brother in the afternoon light, and she held the information, and she looked at her hands, and she said nothing for a while. Then she said, "He's been working against Palpatine for 6 years. Yes, from inside." She looked up. Her eyes were clear and direct, and carrying everything she felt with the particular dignity of someone who had decided that feeling things fully was not the same as being governed by them. "Have you spoken to him since Christophsis?" "Twice. Through the dead drop, he found another network vulnerability 4 months ago and sent the coordinates. She absorbed this. And he knows. I know." "He does." She was quiet again. Somewhere in the palace a door opened and closed, the small ordinary sound of a building continuing to be inhabited. A sound that Alderaan made 10,000 times a day, and that Luke listened to with a private and complete gratitude every time he heard it. "All right," she said. It was the same sentence she had used when he told her they were twins. The same 2 words, carrying the same enormous compression of everything that couldn't be said and didn't need to be. The acknowledgement that something was real, the decision to live inside the reality of it, the forward-facing economy of a woman who did not spend more time standing still than the work permitted. "What do you need from me?" she said. He felt the Force move through the garden in its quiet, enormous way, through the pale light and the climbing plants and the afternoon sounds of a planet that was alive and intended to remain so. And he looked at his sister across the table with the full 53 years of what he carried and the full 19 years of what she had become, and said, "I need you to do what you've already been doing. I need you to be exactly who you are." She looked at him for a moment with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether a statement was sufficient or whether she was going to push it. She decided it was sufficient. "Then we're all right," she said. The afternoon light fell across the table between them. The white flowers on the eastern wall moved in the small wind that came over the top of the wall at this hour every day, the reliable small wind of Alderaan's afternoon, as constant as the planets turning. Luke looked at his sister and felt the Force move through them both, and through the garden, and through the planet below, and through everything in the galaxy that was alive and working and not yet finished. And he felt it say what it had said to him in the sand behind the homestead on the first morning of this impossible second life, in the same language the Force always used. Not words, not visions, but the deep, patient current of a universe that was still in the middle of its own story. "You are here. There is work to do." He looked at the garden. He looked at his sister. He looked at the white flowers moving in the afternoon wind. He breathed in. He breathed out. He had work to do. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.